I was sent to stay with my aunt and uncle. They had a bit of a dog problem. A few years ago, I was sent to stay with my aunt and uncle on their farm as a punishment. I live near a big farming community in the middle of nowhere, who mainly focus on sheep, but some tend to have a small herd of cows. Not too super sure why. My mom was furious with me because I hated school and skipped all the time with my mate. And some snobby mate of my mom spotted us in the park with a weird-looking cigarette. Obviously, my mom is ex-army and can't be caught with anything in the house and had me drug tested. Positive for marijuana, of course. So for the entirety of half term, I was sent to the middle of nowhere. For any Americans who might find this, half term is a week's break halfway through the term. We always have a week off mid-February, so I was stuck on some Arctic temperature farm high up in the hills. Freezing is an understatement. Picture bare hills only covered in heather bushes that are up to your knee, thigh height. No trees for shelter from the wind, and up on those hills is biting cold. It feels like tiny ice daggers piercing your skin. I've never experienced such cold anywhere else, and I've never been up there in the snow, so I can't imagine how much worse that is. My aunt and uncle keep around 700 sheep. They had a herd of 30 cows. They also kept around 30 chickens that would roam around the courtyard and into barns. One thing about where they live is they have a lot of historic barns made of stone. A lot of them are pretty derelict and dangerous, but most farmers that have them on their land make sure to somewhat maintain them so that their livestock can take shelter when the weather takes a turn for the worst. I'll try to get a bit more on track. I was sent here for the week to help out, which was one term that was used. I snuck a 10 bag of weed up with me because I wasn't about to spend a week in the middle of nowhere, bored out of my brain, shoveling up sheep shit, and maybe dealing with a premature, slimy, disgusting lamb. Lambing season was around the corner. My uncle seemed happy to have an extra pair of hands, and lucky for me, when I arrived Friday afternoon after school, I was dragged along to help turn the cows out of the barn, since the weather was supposed to be on the upturn now. We headed out on a quad bike with 2 dogs in tow, and sticks in hand in case cows got a bit rowdy in their new sense of freedom. Nothing interesting happened on the trip driving the cows out to a further away field. Due to the location of the farm, not all the land was visible from the main farm. It's hilly, so a lot of the pastures may be further above or below. So one of the tasks we would have to do was to go check on certain areas and make sure nothing was awry. I remember the same Friday night after we turned out the cows. As the sun began to set, my aunt headed out on the quad bike with one of their dogs to check on the herd. I think I was told that because they'd been inside for a while, they'd get excitable to be back out, so best go check that they've not got lost or done something stupid like try to jump a gate or get stuck, which was apparently more common than I'd have thought. I stayed back at the house with a scalding cup of coffee next to the fire to warm up. My uncle had sat with me to watch TV when my aunt returned. He was asking her if all's good as she removed her big work boots. Mostly, she'd said. Only bloody 29 of them out there. Started getting a bit too dark, and my torch died, so thought I'd just come back down, and we'll see if she's made her way back to the rest of them tomorrow. My uncle looked a little annoyed, but didn't seem too worried. Most of the animals in the area tend to know their patch and will usually stick to it. So when one wanders off, they will usually know how to get back to the rest of their herd. Tomorrow my aunt would go check again. Nothing else happened that first night. We probably just had tea, then went to bed. Their Wi-Fi wasn't great, so after getting annoyed that my messages weren't sending, I just went to bed. Day 2, I was woken up at 7:30 a.m. I don't think I've ever gotten up that early, even for school. My eyes felt like they were burning, but I was just getting nagged at every 5 minutes. So I wrapped up in as many layers that I could physically put on, and was loaded into the back of a quad to go fill a small trailer with bags of feed and hay. Even with my thick winter gloves, my fingers still went numb as I scooped feed into the old feed bags to take out to the flock of animals. It didn't take too long to load up the food, maybe only 20 minutes, and we soon began our little deliveries to closer fields and any animals that may have been in nearby barns. We'd pull up into a field, and animals would begin their sprint towards us as we poured out feed in long lines for the animals to eat off the ground. It probably took us another hour and a half to finish feeding the nearby animals, and by now I was feeling sick with hunger. So my aunt and I headed back to the house to my uncle, who had prepared a small fry-up. We ate and enjoyed the warmth of the house before making a flask of tea and heading out to pick up my aunt's dog, Fennel, or Fen for short, as it's easier to yell. Fennel hopped on the back of the quad bike behind me, happily panting away as we set out to check on the cattle. I'd zoned out for most of the journey, but after a 10-minute ride out east of the farm, we'd arrived at a patch of land with cows. I didn't like to get too close to the animals usually, because they were always muddy and covered in their own shit, but I have to admit cow faces are quite cute. I stayed seated on the quad, scanning the herd with my eyes as my aunt began to count out loud. I would have tried to help, but someone else counting always seemed to throw you off. 30. Perfect. She must have found her way back. My aunt sighed in relief and hopped off the quad. Fennel hopped off too and followed close to my aunt as she began to move around the herd and check out her livestock. Can you start spreading out that hay before they realize it's in the trailer and start surrounding the quad? My aunt asked quickly, looking towards me before stalking around the cattle. I shivered, almost feeling a bit of relief to be moving to try to keep my body warm. The wind wasn't as strong that day, but it was definitely no warmer than the day before. I started grabbing armfuls of itchy hay that stuck to my woolen scarf and throwing it to the ground. Slightly panicked at the large cattle lumbering my way, I tried to pick up the speed a bit. What I didn't notice, though, was my aunt's concerned and annoyed look as she walked back towards me in the quad bike. "Come here," she said to me. I was suddenly worried at the cold tone of her voice and slowly walked over. "What's up?" I asked, trying not to sound too nervous. "Look at this." She headed towards a cow who was too busy eating hay from the trailer to really pay us much mind. I was oblivious to what I was looking at. "Look at her back leg." My aunt placed her hand onto the cow's rear thigh. Suddenly I noticed large wounds on the cow's leg. It was quite a mess. You could see through the fur large slash marks and deep ragged tears in her flesh. It seemed the blood had mainly begun to dry. "What happened to it?" I questioned. "I reckon she was the one I didn't count last night. It doesn't look like she's fallen off a ledge and done it like that. It would have been broken or she would have been more scuffed up or still missing. I saw the poor thing limping over for the hay. This is exactly why we're allowed to shoot dogs on our land," my aunt huffed angrily. "A dog did this?" I said with a look of disbelief. "It must have been a big dog, mind." "Most likely. I can't think of it being anything else. We'll have to head down to the yard and pick up iodine to clean it, and hopefully she won't get an infection." I was mildly irritated by this, as it meant us driving back to the farm and then back out again. Fennel ran alongside the quad on a route back to burn off some energy, and we soon arrived back at the farm before heading out back to the cattle again. When we arrived back, we decided to put a head collar on the cow and tie her to a gate to restrain her slightly, to apply the iodine to the wound. The cows weren't as nervy as the sheep, since most of them had spent more time around people than the sheep had. So it wasn't too much of a struggle to treat the wound. I made more of a fuss as I lost balance while supplying the liquid and got some on my jeans. If you know iodine, you know there is no chance of getting it off your clothes. I wasn't pleased as we headed back. Don't think we did much else that day, so my aunt and uncle headed off to bed early, ready for the next day, and I decided to risk it and roll a joint. Yes, I know I was here because of weed, but I didn't say I'd learnt my lesson. I snuck out the house to the dead silence of the night. It was pitch black and there was no streetlights out here. I lit up and smoked and looked around warily to check. Their bedroom light was still out, and decided to move closer to the barns in case the smell seeped in through their drafty windows. The silence was unsettling. I've never experienced such silence like it at home, since you'd hear the odd car or drunk person stumbling home. Suddenly in the distance I could hear mooing and cows calling. I nearly died of a heart attack. It didn't help that the effects of my joint were beginning to settle in, making me even more nervy of my surroundings. It was so dark. Anything could be stood only 10 meters from me and I'd have no clue. I strained my eyes looking out to the sound of the cows as I began to calm down from the sudden fright, and not long after, I dropped the butt on the floor and stamped it out. I headed back to the house, and as quietly as I could, I took a packet of biscuits from the cupboard, grabbed an apple, and snuck back to the guest room to try to load up a movie on my laptop. The next day I was woken by my uncle. As per usual, the effects of my smoke from the night before left me feeling even more drained than the morning before, and I slipped in and out of sleep as my aunt and uncle asked if I was up and ready. I woke with a start as my aunt shook me awake. "Come on, we've been waiting for you for 10 minutes. I'd also like to know in the future if you're going to eat half a packet of biscuits. Can't be good for your teeth." My aunt scowled and left the room. I felt a little guilty for eating the last of the biscuits, but dragged myself out of bed and dressed for the day. Downstairs on the table was a lukewarm bowl of porridge with honey. After finishing that, I decided to dig through the cupboards for a flask, to try to get back on my aunt and uncle's good side, and make a flask full of coffee to bring out with me. I flicked my eyes around the courtyard before heading to the main barn, to see my uncle taking his dog Jan back from her kennel. "Back with me today, I'm afraid. We're gonna need to head out and check on them cows. Need to make sure that the injured one doesn't get an infection," he told me, as he loaded some hay into the trailer. Not enough to particularly feed the herd, but enough that we would be able to hold their attention as we checked the injured cow, since they had access to grass to eat. I handed my uncle the flask, and he flashed me a cheery smile and a quick thanks. We hopped onto the quad once again, and Jan, being a younger dog, ran ahead as we drove out to the moor. Once we arrived at the herd, Jan lay down in the grass and watched the cattle closely. We hopped off the bike and together lay out the hay a few meters from the trailer, and the cows once again slowly plodded to the site of their new food. We stepped back closer to the quad, and my uncle began to silently watch the animals. I took that as my opportunity to try to count each cow to see if I can beat him to it. 27, 28, 29. Wait. I must have lost count. 28, 29, 29, my uncle grumbled. He shook his head and began to walk around the cattle. Jan slowly stalked behind him. I followed him, flicking my eyes from cow to spy the injured one. I must have looked at each 2 or 3 times when my uncle came to a sudden stop. "I can't believe it. That is so frustrating," he sighed. "Your aunt said it looked like a dog bite, and if it only happened the night before yesterday, surely she can't have had an infection spread so quick." He set off walking away from the herd that looked unbothered at the missing member. I followed my uncle to an old dry stone wall. "I think we're going to have to look around this area. Maybe the wound was hurting her too much and she's sat somewhere taking the weight off it. Or she's got herself stuck in a bog or something," my uncle muttered. "Should we head back to the quad?" I asked, unsure of what to do. "Nah, it'd be quicker covering the area on foot. Plus, if it is a bog, the quad will get stuck and we'd have to walk back." He chuckled with a small look of annoyance on his face. He headed off with Jan across the grass towards a patch of tall grass that seemed to drop off down into the gill. I was a bit stuck on where to start. Unlike my aunt and uncle, I hadn't spent the last 25 years on these hills, so I was a bit worried about getting mysteriously lost or falling off a cliff or something. But my uncle was nearly out of sight now, so I decided to slowly follow the wall. I looked all around at the same hills and grass and shrubbery I'd seen from afar, and slowly wandered downhill into a small dip. I could see 2 trees, leafless and naked, sat sheltered from the high-speed winds on top of the hill, and a small stream heading down to the bottom of the valley. There were many hoof marks in the mud from cattle that had come and sheltered near the trees, but still I could see nothing out of the ordinary. I decided to head back up the hill roughly in the same direction I'd seen my uncle head, since there was nothing to see down here. As I reached the top of the hill out of breath, I could see the cows still grazing around the quad bike. "Anything?" my uncle bellowed from further along the edge of the hill. "Nope." I walked over to him and Jan, and he too looked just as stumped as me. "Let's get back on the quad and we'll check along the top of this area." Still, we saw nothing from the higher hill. No blood, no anything. I'm so confused. I don't know where she could be. I don't imagine she'd have managed to make her way down the gill and back up the other side, especially if her leg was as bad as your aunt said. We're just going to have to head back for now. We turned to ride home. Jan seemed tired now as she scaled down the gill earlier, so she was panting on the quad behind me. As we rode back, my uncle spoke only about the missing cow. My only thought of how she could disappear like this would be a bog, but I've never seen an animal sink so deep into one that it couldn't be seen only overnight. I'd say it was cattle thieves, but why only take one? And an injured one at that? No dog would be big enough to drag away a whole cow. I don't think we'd even have room to move them much closer than they are. They need that space to roam and eat, and our closer fields are full of pregnant ewes, so we can keep an eye on them. Another note to any American that might find this: we don't have any large predators in the UK. Our biggest predator is the badger, so if you're thinking, oh my god, what about bears or coyotes? We don't have them. Me and my uncle arrived back at the farm and headed inside to the fire. Once my aunt arrived from her own chores, we told her about the cow. She seemed equally, if not more, annoyed than my uncle about the cow, before agreeing the next course of action would be simply to keep an eye on the herd. My aunt and uncle went on with their chores, and I was sent off to clear a small stable space and prepare it for my aunt to bring in a sheep that had given birth prematurely to twins. Once the stable space was ready and occupied, I was then sent around to hunt down any rogue eggs from the chickens. They'd like to lay them in the hay storage since the hay made the perfect nest. I got on with the chores assigned and prayed that if I just got on with it, my aunt and uncle might just forget about the biscuit incident. After we had eaten tea, my uncle once again headed out to the cows with a large torch to have a look around the area, since by now the winter darkness was thick and made it hard to see. My aunt and I watched TV, and I received a small lecture about worrying my mom and how I should do better at school. About 40 minutes later, my uncle returned looking disgruntled, and not long after, everyone headed to bed. During the night, I woke with a jump and a light gasp. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would jump out of my throat. I don't know what startled me awake, so my only assumption was maybe I was having a nightmare. In the distance, I could once again hear the cows calling out across the hills. I don't particularly know how I could hear them so clearly, since they weren't super close, but my only guess is it's because of how silent it was on the night. Their sounds cut through the air so easily. I woke to my 4th day on the farm. This time I had set an alarm so my aunt wouldn't have to wake me up again, and I groggily got out of bed and dressed. I hadn't heard my aunt and uncle that morning, so I headed down to the kitchen and looked out of the window. The dogs were gone, so I guess they had already headed out and began working, which was slightly annoying because that meant I could have slept for longer. I ate some toast and slumped into a chair to flick through my phone. Before long, I heard a growling engine of a quad bike. I pulled on my coat and wandered out of the house toward my aunt and uncle. "Everything okay?" I asked. "2 more cows are gone. Not a single clue on where to," my uncle replied flatly. "I'm going to finish up what I was doing this morning and drive out to Frank and Haley's to mention what's been going on," my aunt said to my uncle before marching off towards the barn. Frank and Haley had land near my aunt and uncle's, apparently. "Get wrapped up as we're heading back over with more iodine. Another one has wounds all up her legs," my uncle huffed. I sighed and quickly headed back to the house to wrap up. On the journey over, my uncle began to rant. "You see, there's a lot of walking routes through our land. You might have noticed the sties for hikers to cross fences and some of the signs." I shrugged. If I'm honest, I hadn't noticed at all. "My new theory, other than a bog, is walkers and their dogs. Like how you and your aunt found the injured cow on Saturday, remember? Since we've had another one with similar injuries and now 3 gone, I can only guess it's people with a dog out of control. Maybe the dog chased them until they got too lost to find their way back. Or worse, the cow ended up dead and the owners were worried about being caught and managed to remove the body. I don't know. He sounded like he was grasping at straws. I wasn't sure what to think, but it was beginning to unsettle me. Another bumpy ride out and we arrived at the field. My uncle had brought both Jan and Fennel with him to help survey the area. He headed straight for a white and red-brown cow that had appeared to be limping quite badly, and slipped a rope around her neck. He led her back towards the wall to a gate, and I tied her to it. I grabbed the iodine from the quad and trotted towards them. Jan and Fennel sniffed the ground, wandering around the area, seemingly careless to the situation. This cow once again had deep, ragged wounds, as if something had latched on, not wanting to let go. I shuddered slightly. This cow's injuries were worse than the first. Both rear legs and up to her thighs and flank were scuffed up and scratched, and her off-white fur was bloodied red and brown. My uncle attempted to soothe her as I sprayed iodine over her wounds, coating them in the rusty orange liquid. I think we're going to have to rejig our field layouts to move the herd closer if we can't work out what's going on. We really can't afford to lose many more of them, said my uncle, with a hint of sadness in his voice. I'm just so frustrated. I've never had anything like this happen before. We've always managed to work out any problems with our livestock. It's just irritating that we may have to move some sheep into the barn prematurely when we could have left them out until closer to their due date. My uncle untied the cow and gave her a light push toward the rest of the herd, and then walked back to the quad bike. I followed behind, watching the cows graze, unaware to the increasing worry for their safety. One cow sniffed at the injuries on the wounded one's leg, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow towards them. Maybe they did know what was going on? Back at the farm, my uncle went off to complete any other tasks around the farm. I once again had smaller tasks like collecting eggs and restocking the feed container. I fed the mother ewe and cleaned up the kitchen and the house, but in between tasks I would find myself looking out towards the hills that hid the herd of cattle. I would catch myself staring for a few seconds, then 10 more, wondering what was going on when no one could see. My aunt returned that evening before tea. No news. Frank and Haley hadn't experienced anything similar, and suggested if we suspected foul play, to possibly talk to the police, and if they couldn't help, possibly the council about walking routes in the area, because if it was hikers, then maybe they could close the trails in the area due to issues with the livestock. The night came and went, and the morning was soon over too. The injured cow had disappeared in the night. I was sad, and beginning to experience some of the anger my aunt and uncle were clearly feeling. I was annoyed that we didn't know what was happening, or why, or how to stop it. So the only thing we could think to do was to execute my uncle's plan from the day before. A flock of sheep from a field neighboring the farmyard rounded up into the barn in the courtyard, a month early. All 5 of us, myself, my aunt, uncle, and the 2 dogs, made our way back to the patch of land where the cows grazed. As per usual, there had not been a single sign on where the cow from the day before had ended up. So the dogs were sent round the herd, nipping and barking in order to have the cows start the slow trip back towards the farm. Jan and Fennel flanked the left and right whilst we followed behind on quad bikes. Riding out to the patch would normally take about 10 minutes, but with a slow, plodding herd of cows it took almost triple. The cows' new field was much smaller than the patch they had grazed before, and since a flock of sheep had been in the field until that morning, the grass was somewhat diminished. But as my uncle had said on arrival, it'd have to do for now until we knew what was going on. My aunt and uncle had a new sense of confidence with the herd in their new location, especially with the field being so close to the farm. It had a wall all the way around, unlike the last plot, and no hiker walkways through. My uncle headed off towards the town to log the disturbance with the police. Whilst my uncle was away, my aunt and I got on with other jobs around the farm. Before I knew it, it was dark again. My uncle arrived home not long after we ate, and again, my aunt and uncle headed to bed for an early night. I went to bed not long after. The cows were louder that night as I tried to sleep. The field was close to the house, so their calls were heard more clearly. Luckily, they weren't so loud to keep me awake, especially after another long day out in the winter air. So I soon knocked out and woke up to the dim morning light filtering through the gap in my curtains, and the sound of my aunt and uncle moving around the house. There was a positive feel in the air, and wouldn't you know it, we walked over to the field and not a single cow was missing or harmed. My aunt and uncle were ecstatic since their issue appeared to be fixed. It didn't solve the mystery on what had happened to the missing cows, but it was a positive change. Whilst most of me was happy for the herd and my aunt and uncle, I could feel a small thread of doubt in my stomach. I went about chores in the yard throughout the morning, often glancing back towards the field. As the day rolled on, I was roped into heading out to check over a flock of sheep and deliver food to them with my uncle. The sheep had been unproblematic my entire stay on the farm. An older ewe was getting a bit lame, so my uncle had me examine her hoof with him and applied some iodine. Much to my surprise, my uncle insisted I drove the quad back to the farm for a change. So he climbed on the back as I had for much of the week and gave me a rundown on the patrols. A very jolty and janky start later, I had us under control and back to the courtyard. The quad bike wasn't so hard to drive. I have to say it was pretty fun driving the quad. It felt a lot more freeing than being the passenger on the back. Nothing particularly interesting happened for the rest of the day. As we had every night before this, we ate tea and sat in the living room with the roaring fire and watched some TV to relax and rest our aching muscles. I took some time before my aunt and uncle went to bed to take a hot bath. My whole body ached from the 5 days I had spent on the farm. It had long been dark outside by the time I was out of the bath and dry. As I creeped back to the guest room, I could hear a light sound of snoring and grumbling from my aunt and uncle's room. I decided to be naughty. I rolled a joint for myself and pulled back on my layers of warm clothing. I stuffed my supplies back into the lining of my bag and slowly stepped downstairs. Out the back door I crept and silently stalked across the courtyard toward the barn in the pitch black. In the dark I couldn't see the cow's field. However, I could almost sense it there. And thinking about the field tied my thread of doubt into a larger knot. I was on the edge of being out in the dark in the middle of nowhere. And with everything that had been going on, I just wanted to smoke and feel the waves of calmness flow through my body. I lit up my joint and began to smoke away. Usually I would flick through videos on my phone, but there was no signal so far from the house, so I decided on some quiet music and to try to enjoy the silence of the moorland surroundings. I hadn't paid too much mind to the low drone of the cows up until now, but without a notice they began to crescendo into the loud chorus I had heard throughout the nights before. The knot in my stomach sunk into a pit of anxiety, but some weird force drew me toward the field. By now, my eyes had mildly adjusted to the dim starlight, and I could make out shapes in the darkness. A stupid magnetic force, or maybe my own dumb curiosity, pulled me towards the wall. Stood so close to them now, their calls deafening. I wanted to know why the cattle had never seemed to sleep. The dark blobs of what I guessed were the remaining cows moved around the field. I could make out cows leaning their heads back one after the other, mooing and calling out into the cold air. I don't know why, maybe it was the weed, but I was mesmerized by the animals. I stood watching them for what felt like an hour, but in reality it must have been about 5 minutes before I stubbed out the butt of the joint and dropped it. Without thinking, I scaled the stone wall and dropped into the field. The shadows of the cattle continued to move restlessly around the small patch of grass. For some reason I wasn't tired. I think the cold air had woken me up from my post-bath drowsiness. I tiptoed over an old water trough to sit and watch the cattle for a while. Their shadows became almost hypnotizing in the dark, due to my slightly inebriated state. Slowly, I felt sickness creeping up my throat, and the anxious pit in my stomach grew and felt like it was trying to jump out of my mouth. I was confused. Why was I suddenly so scared? I began to try to slow my breathing by taking deep, shaky breaths. The cold air pierced my lungs as I took breath after breath, trying to cure my fear. Unsure if it was working, I started to prepare to head back to the house. It was most likely the darkness unsettling me, so I stood. Then I froze. My eyes had been flicking from cow to cow during my inner commotion until I locked eyes onto one. It looked odd. It stumbled slowly forward amongst the others. Were her legs broken? Her shoulders seemed to be jutting up above her spine, and she was grumbling and wailing. A small wave of reality passed over me, and I was about to head to the house and alert my aunt and uncle of a cow with what appeared to be a broken leg. But before I'd worked up the courage to move, I jumped as the cow's head suddenly whipped and cracked into an unnatural shape. My whole body began to quiver. What the fuck was I witnessing? The cow groaned a haunting sound as its head began twisting and twisting. Its spine jolted and snapped, and its legs creaked into sharp, crooked shapes. I couldn't move. I noticed its eyes. How could I see its eyes? I couldn't see many details on the other cows before this, so why could I see its eyes? I don't know how, but I knew they were set too far back in its crooked skull. It groaned again. Why did it sound almost human? Fuck, why does it sound so human? My whole body was shaking. The thing dragged itself forward. By now, the other cattle began to separate themselves from the thing forming before them. Still, I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It pulled and tore at the ground, appearing to struggle and maneuver its broken and bent body. I yelped and slapped my hands across my mouth to quell any more unwanted noise. The creature had suddenly bound forward with swift speed. Its broken jaw unhinged like a fucking snake and revealed rows of jagged teeth that glinted in the moonlight. Its jaw clasped shut upon the flank of a terrified cow, which called out in pain and heart-stopping fear. A shaky and clammy hand pulled itself away from the other on top of my quivering lips, and weakly felt around for the wall behind me. Carefully, I took one large step around the bucket I had been sat on, and slowly applied pressure to the ground to avoid creating too much noise. The creature struggled and tugged upon the cow's flank, tearing and ripping through fur and flesh before snapping shut further down on the leg of the cow. She was clearly screaming in distress, but there was no chance I was stepping in against whatever the hell that thing was. Another step backwards, and I could feel the damp wall on my fingertips, and gripped onto the stone like it was the last thing I would ever touch. Not once did my eyes leave the traumatizing scene played out ahead of me. I stifled a gag as the sound I will never forget burrowed its way into my ears, tearing, screaming, clunking, and a snap as the leg of the unfortunate cow was ripped from its body and swiftly swallowed whole by the monster in the middle of the field. The animal collapsed, probably from stress and shock, and before I knew it, the creature's disgusting mouth grew larger and began to engulf the still-moving cow. Finally, tears stung my eyes as I watched every last detail of the horror show in front of me, and as I watched the creature bow its head backward, and its crooked body bend and snap as the final limb of its victim slipped through its teeth into its bottomless stomach, strength returned to my muscles and I whipped around and threw myself over the wall. I didn't hesitate for a second before launching myself into a sprint back to the house. I fumbled with the door as my clammy hand slipped from the door handle. After a couple seconds, I was behind the locked door, panting and hyperventilating. Just as quickly as the strength returned to me, it was sapped away, and I slid down the door onto the cold floor of the kitchen. I was sobbing with my hands across my mouth to drown out the wails of shock, grief, and fear that was pouring out of me. The deafening sound of the cows calling and chanting felt like it was all around me. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my hands to my mouth to control the sounds of my cries. I don't know how long I was sat by that door. God knows I couldn't stand up. My wails slowly became small whimpers, and behind the door I could hear the cows beginning to settle. My knees were still too weak to stand, and I was growing suddenly more worried about my aunt and uncle finding me here. So, painfully, I crawled slowly, shakily, across the hard kitchen floor. Splinters speared my palms, causing each hand that hit the ground sharp pangs of pain. I dragged myself up the stairs and clumsily into the guest room. By now, exhaustion was setting in, though I thought I'd never be able to sleep again. I managed to use a chest of drawers to pull myself up onto my feet and took heavy, shaky steps towards the bed. My body dropped like dead weight onto the soft surface of the mattress, and I fumbled with the zip of my coat, which after a couple of attempts was promptly thrown onto the floor. I struggled to pull off my boots before blankly staring at my hands speckled with splinters. I was numb. My brain had shut down. I felt nothing. I was emotionally exhausted, so my head fell back and hit the pillow, and I was asleep before even attempting to remove a single splinter. In the darkness of my sleep, all I could see was the shadow of a bent and crooked creature. I couldn't escape it. It was like an unending image. It didn't move. It just stared towards me for hours. I could feel every single second, every single hour of my slumber. Not once did that image change or disappear. I will never forget the sound of that cow in distress, or the sight of the creature's unhinged jaw swallowing it all. After hours of unending, torturous sleep, I opened my burning eyes. All the pain and fear hit me again, and I once again began to sob. Tears hit and stung my palms, seeping into the small wounds of my hands around the splinters. I couldn't stay here for 3 more days. I jumped as I heard feet plodding toward my door, and quickly stifled my whimpers. "You up?" My aunt's voice rang from behind the door. As she began to twist the doorknob, she couldn't see me like this. I don't know what I'd say. I don't think I would have been able to physically explain what I saw. I don't think they would have even believed me anyway. "Yes," I choked. "I'll be a minute." I decided I best remove the splinters from my palms to avoid more pain, so I sniffed and wiped my eyes before painstakingly removing each splinter. It would have been easier to remove the night before, had I been in a state to, as by then my skin had begun to swell around each splinter, making the removal more difficult. After about 5 minutes, my palms were splinter-free, and I warily pulled on some clothes. In the normality of preparing for another morning, I'd started to convince myself maybe what I'd seen the night before wasn't real. Maybe Mom was right about drugs, and it had been some kind of drug-induced psychosis. I dragged each foot in an exhausting march downstairs to see the comforting image of my aunt and uncle sat together eating breakfast. They seemed happy, positive that their cattle were safe and unharmed. I felt sick. "You all right? You look like death," my uncle jested as I dropped into a seat. I'm fine," I replied flatly, before taking a long sip of tea from the mug set next to my own plate of food. "Did you sleep okay?" my aunt asked, with a bit more concern than my uncle. "I think," I mumble in a monotonous voice. Nothing much else was said at the table. My aunt and uncle exchanged worried glances without a word, but stayed seated with me until I'd finished with my food. I hadn't managed to eat much, as I was worried I'd throw it all back up. My uncle swiftly cleared the table before heading to find his boots. "Right," he began. "Let's get to it." Their chipper attitudes comforted me. Maybe I did imagine it. Maybe, once I was outside, I'd see there were still 26 cows and all would be fine. I quietly excused myself to grab my wellies from upstairs. My aunt and uncle looked confused at this, as we always kept shoes downstairs. "I don't remember seeing you wearing them upstairs." The 3 of us made our way outside. I thought my small amount of breakfast was going to evacuate my stomach as soon as the morning air hit me, and begrudgingly followed close behind my aunt as the couple walked towards the field. I couldn't see their faces as they stood at the wall counting the cows. I didn't even dare look at the field. I just stared blankly at the wall. I couldn't bring myself to look. For a moment I felt more confident I had imagined last night's events, as there was no immediate reaction to the horror I imagined was still within the walls. 25? How can there only be 25? I thought we'd fixed it. You're joking me. I was back at the house, screaming. What's wrong? What's going on? My poor aunt begged me to open up to her. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't speak. Everything that left my mouth was sobs and whimpers. I have to go home. After 35 minutes of straight crying, those were the only words my broken voice could croak. My aunt was baffled. My uncle wasn't about to argue with my wishes after he had watched me spin on my heel and beeline back to the house and become inconsolable. They drove me home an hour later. I think they were just too shocked at my sudden change in demeanor and didn't know what else to do. From my room, I heard them speaking to my mom, asking if she had said anything to me, if anything had happened, or what the hell could be wrong with me. I think she was just as confused, that, or convinced I'd pulled some stupid stunt to be brought home early. I never did tell my aunt and uncle what I saw. I couldn't. I have tried, but I can't do it. I choke on my words, and I get overwhelmed. I think they nearly sent me for psychiatric assessment at one point. Not sure why it didn't happen, but I'm glad it didn't. I've tried so fucking hard to forget about what I saw that night. But all I see, every time I close my eyes, is that broken, crooked spine and its twisted jaw. Every single night. This happened long ago now. I never went back to their farm. I never thought I'd ever be able to retell my story of the trip to the farm. But recently I caught up with my aunt for the first time since lockdown. Much to my horror, she brought up my stay at their farm. Every single cow disappeared. They wanted to hook up CCTV, but were never able to create a power supply close enough to wherever they kept their herd. They never found out what happened to their cows, and they never owned a herd of cows again. Hearing this had the memory in the front of my mind, and I don't know how to deal with it anymore. I heard writing is meant to be therapeutic, and writing apparently isn't the same as talking, seeing as I'm able to recount it here. I don't know if writing will help me, but I pray it does. To my aunt or uncle, if you see this, I'm so sorry I never told you what I saw. I don't know if you'd ever believe me, or if you'd think it was some kind of stupid psychotic break. But if it helps, I've not smoked since because I've tried once and I don't know how I survived that night. I wish I could go back before that night and stayed clueless on what happened to those cows. I feel like things would be more different. I'm sorry I don't see you guys as often anymore. I can't bring myself to. I love you both so much. I wish I had done more. Hey all, this is Matt of Imagine the Horror. I just wanted to say that no cows were harmed in the production of these sounds. They are just regular cow moos. I also want to thank today's author and the authors who have let me narrate their works. They are listed here on screen. Thank you for listening.